Folks, thanks for coming along tonight, where Linda Jaivin makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute after quite a few years. She's been here 4 times, I think, but she's coming back tonight on the occasion of the publication of Bombard the Headquarters, The Cultural Revolution in China. I'll introduce her briefly. She's been studying Chinese politics and language and culture for more than 40 years. She's been a foreign correspondent in China and is co-editor of the China Story Yearbook, an associate of the Australian Centre on China and the World at the ANU in Canberra, and author of 12 books, including The Shortest History of China. She lived in Taiwan between 77 and 79. She went to Hong Kong, and then she went to the mainland, I think in 79, and left in 86, and then travelled around, speaks fluent in Mandarin and not too bad at Cantonese, but tonight in English. So Linda Jaivin is going to talk on China's Cultural Revolution Revisited. Linda, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Gerard, and thank you all for coming out this evening. And thank you to all who are watching this online as well. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I am very grateful to their stewardship of the land, and I do appreciate that. And they were the original storytellers, so I take inspiration from that as well. Now, in August 1966, with the command "Bombard the Headquarters," Mao Zedong, chairman of the Communist Party of China, spurred on the Cultural Revolution that the party had, with mixed emotions, endorsed 2.5 months earlier. The great helmsman, as he was called, was convinced that the revolution that he had helmed was in mortal danger. Mao had been one of the original founders of the Communist Party of China in 1921. By the time the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, he had been working towards a Chinese revolution for 28 years. He'd fought and sacrificed and thought a lot about what this revolution should look like. Now, after the communists won the Chinese Civil War, Mao put China on a crash course of ideological indoctrination and economic collectivization. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward. He believed that by harnessing the will of the people, he could propel the nation into a state of true communism. Private property was abolished, and the nation was divided into people's communes. Now, the party ordered everyone to throw their cooking woks and metal window frames into neighborhood furnaces to forge steel, and told farmers to plant crops 4 times as densely as usual. Factories were given similar orders to hurry up production. Of course, those furnaces simply made pig iron. And of course, the crops failed. But Mao had claimed that this would lead to a quadrupling of the nation's agricultural and industrial output. And he refused to listen to the objections of agricultural scientists and other experts. And when one of the collective leadership of the party, his defense minister and long-term comrade, Peng Dehuai, dared to warn of imminent starvation if this continued, Mao had him purged. In fact, Mao threatened that if the rest of the party supported Peng Dehuai, he, Mao, would go to the countryside and raise a new army to overthrow his own government. His command to bombard the headquarters in 1966, in other words, was not the first time he threatened to overturn his own party's leadership. And it was closely related to that time, because, of course, the Great Leap Forward was an unmitigated disaster. And it was, it combined with some natural disasters that happened at the time, and the withdrawal of all Soviet aid when the Soviet Union and China broke off relations at the end of the 50s. This led to a nationwide famine and tens of millions of deaths. I sort of settle on about 40 million. That seems to be kind of more or less agreed. Some people claim 70 million. I'm not sure that the evidence is there. People have studied local gazettes and so on for reports of excess deaths. I'm not a demographer, but the tens of millions is absolutely solid. You can say that. Now, the Great Leap Forward only ended because others in the party, notably General Secretary Deng Xiaoping and the president, Liu Shaoqi, introduced mitigating measures, such as allowing farmers to keep or even sell some of the food that they grew. This happened because there was a party secretary in Anhui province who realized that he was facing something like 10 million deaths in his province alone if he didn't take some kind of action. So what he did was he said, okay, the farmers each had a quota, a grain quota, or whatever they were growing, and once they had given their quota to the state, they could keep whatever they grew above that. They could use it to feed their families, or they could trade, sell on limited free markets. Now, Mao probably did not know the extent of the famine, because the system of information was such that if you were on the bottom level and you said, it's not really working here, we're not actually, the crops are failing, you could be punished. You know, you have done something that the party that Mao says, he says, with the force of your will, you are going to create these amazing harvests. And people were very afraid to so they would exaggerate, they would make things up, and that actually made things a lot worse. People reporting fake bumper harvests and so on. But Mao would have known something. Anyway, he was furious at Deng and Liu and the ones who supported them. And the thing is, the party everybody was a bit concerned. I mean, people were dying and they all knew this. And so they kind of sidelined Mao, not officially, but he wasn't the one calling the shots on this. And he did not like not calling the shots. He was absolutely furious. He believed that Deng and Liu were diverting China from its revolutionary path towards capitalism. And that is why he called them capitalist roaders. You might have heard that. They were putting China on the capitalist road. Mao was paranoid, increasingly paranoid. I'm not talking about a psychological condition. I'm just, using that word in a looser sense. He believed that his colleagues were, Deng, Liu, and some other colleagues were in a conspiracy to undermine him and his vision and the revolution itself. Now, his vision called for continual revolution. Class struggle, as he put it, every year, every month, every day, even though supposedly they had overthrown exploiting classes to create the revolutionary society in 1949. He believed that if the Chinese people failed to maintain vigilance and class consciousness, even in a revolutionary society, then academic elites and other bourgeois authorities would undermine the revolution itself. And this had happened, he believed, in the Soviet Union. He saw Khrushchev's policies of de-Stalinization, a cultural thaw, and the denunciation of personality cults as a direct threat to his own legacy and his own legitimacy. He described the state of communism in the Soviet Union as revisionism. It was bureaucratic, it was static, it was not revolutionary. So in the early 60s, while he was being kind of sidelined from power, he continued to talk about this, and he talked about cultural revolution often. He was like, we have to have a cultural revolution. It will reactivate class struggle. He believed in prioritizing mass movements over administrative process. Administrative process was sort of strangling the revolution with bureaucracy. He wanted to take down his enemies, and the Cultural Revolution was also about destroying China's traditional culture, including its people's habits, beliefs, and so on, in order to you level the ground and then you build an entirely new socialist culture on the ruins of the old one. And if you don't take the whole thing down, you can't build the new. Now, part of this new political culture that he was beginning to formulate, because he was the sort of person, he actually spoke about things happen first. You have the practice, in his words, and then you get the theory. So he didn't believe in coming up with a theory and then going along with it, which is why he went against classical Marxism. Classical Marxism would not have tolerated this idea of forced collectivization and we're going to propel ourselves straight into communism. Classical Marxism was like you have to go through these different stages first, including capitalism and so on. He was like, no. So he believed you practice and then you work out your theory. So one of the things that had happened in the early 60s in this little town called Maple Bridge was that there's a lot of social dislocation following the famine. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of, dissent and everything else. And the local authorities didn't have the resources to take care of it. They came up with this idea, and it was that everybody would look at, monitor, report on, police, and even punish everybody else. Mao really liked that. It was called the Maple Bridge Experience, and he called it mass dictatorship, which is the exercising of dictatorship over the masses by the masses themselves. All citizens were to do all this. They were to monitor, report on, and so on, other people for criminal and ideological wrongdoing. Now, another thing that Mao was thinking about in this time was he was thinking China's youth are growing soft. They've been raised on socialism. They take it for granted. His generation fought wars. They fought a civil war. They fought against the Japanese. They, were tempered in battle, literal battle. And he felt that China needed a generation of worthy and committed revolutionary successors. So when he started this Cultural Revolution for real in 1966, and when China's youth leapt into action to defend him and this program of Cultural Revolution, this program of bombarding the headquarters, taking down his enemies, taking down educational institutions and the authorities within them, including the teachers and so on, calling themselves Red Guards. This was a development he had not foreseen, but he happily endorsed. This was great. The myriad threads, he said, that make up the principles of Marxism come down to one thing: to rebel is justified. And that became the Red Guard slogan: to rebel is justified. By the end of that August 1966, the Red Guards had persecuted nearly 2,000 people to death or driven them to suicide in Beijing alone. The city's crematorium could not keep up with the bodies. The Cultural Revolution soon spread from the campuses to the factories and the offices, from the cities to the countryside, where some of the most brutal killings took place when a campaign started the following year to eliminate class enemies. The radicals, meanwhile, split into factions as a movement goes on, and it became clear that Mao was actually attacking Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, something that wasn't totally clear from the very beginning to the public. It was clear to the people in the party. The Red Guards are like, well, wait a minute, this two-line struggle in the leadership. Who do we support? What do we support? There were disagreements about how violent should we be? Should we be nonviolent? Those people lost out, the nonviolent ones. But how violent should we be? What should we do? What are our tactics? Lots of different things. And so the radicals, including Red Guards, including radical workers, began splitting into factions by the end of 1966, and they brawled in the streets and campuses. And this went on for several years. After the army was told to get involved in the Cultural Revolution, it was over the objection of many veteran generals who tried to stop it. That was called the February Counter. What was it called? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Countercurrent, February Countercurrent. That was in 1967. The army was told, you need to support the most radical faction when there's different factions vying for power and supremacy. Now, After the army got involved, as you can imagine, factional battles became incredibly deadly. They supplied everything from submachine guns and grenades to the students and the workers and the others, and sometimes the students and workers and others who weren't cooperating with the PLA, they would go and just steal it. They would, raid the armories. And in some cases, the Red Guards and others actually captured shipments of arms that were destined for the Viet Cong. So, yeah. They fought with automatic weapons, they fought with grenades, they fought with tanks, and at least in one case, warships. I mean, just imagine teenagers, with this stuff. The politics at the top level were so impossibly complex and quite opaque in some ways. And the messages issued by the party and its media were frequently contradictory. Even Mao would sort of say, okay, now we're going to end the Cultural Revolution. Now the Cultural Revolution is going to end some other time. We're going to have a Cultural Revolution every these things, these messages that were coming through were very contradictory. Now, to call the Cultural Revolution anarchic or even a form of civil war is not an exaggeration. In fact, at the end of 1966, at a dinner for his 73rd birthday, Mao shocked his closest colleagues in the party. Not that they dared show it at the time. I've read a memoir in Chinese by one of the leading Cultural Revolution group figures who was at this dinner. And he's like, and we had this dish, and we had that dish, and we had this dish. And then Mao raised his glass and toasted to civil war. And the person who wrote the memoir, Qi Banyu, he was like, we were all pretty shocked, but none of us dared to show it. So Mao confounded the people around him frequently. He kept them on their toes. He played them off one another. You never were secure in this, and that was one source of his power. His wife, Jiang Qing, was the leader of one of the most radical groups in the new Cultural Revolution leading group, or the leadership within the party. The old party structures were beginning to fall apart. The Politburo, there's a kind of a way the party is supposed to be run. So there's the members, the Central Committee, the Politburo Standing Committee. This is, it's a hierarchy. But now you've got this group called the Cultural Revolution Leading Group, and they've got more power than others in the Politburo, and eventually the Politburo just gets dissolved. So, it was quite chaotic. Jiang Qing was a leader of this radical group. When Mao, towards the end of his life, there was a decade of Cultural Revolution, when he was getting a bit fed up with them and they're taking a lot of initiative to do things when he hadn't said, you can do that, he called them a Gang of Four. That was the name that has stuck ever since. Now, by the time the Cultural Revolution wound up in 1976, after his death, close to 2 million people were dead. We don't have absolute figures. The official figures are 1.7 million, and that was that's when the party was actually talking about things in the early 80s still. Millions more were left with life-changing injuries. More than 70,000 families were wiped out in their entirety during the elimination of class enemies, during those various campaigns, and the entire nation was left in trauma. Nobody was unaffected. Now, it may seem like those events in China are long ago and far away, especially with, modernizing China, which is quite different in the way it operates. But this history is not just of academic interest. The history of the Cultural Revolution is vitally important to our understanding of China today and beyond, as I will show. To begin with China itself, the Communist Party has since the late 70s put itself on quite a different path than the one that Mao envisioned. That has involved the relaxation of many social and cultural controls, You know, people can have boyfriends and girlfriends, and you couldn't do that in Mao's day. And a lot of people sleep together, and you know, and there's single mothers and all this stuff. I mean, that would be, ooh, that wouldn't have happened. The opening of the economy to market forces is something that would never have happened under Mao, and the opening of the country itself to exchange and trade, open trade, and lots of things with the West. Over the nearly 50 years since Mao's death, China, as we all know, has grown rich and strong, even if there are serious structural issues within the economy, inequalities in the distribution of wealth, and obviously ongoing human rights abuses, including in regions such as Xinjiang and Tibet, not to mention the suppression of free speech and even lawyers arguing for the rights that are laid out in the Chinese constitution itself. Okay. But in 1981, how did the party itself deal with this period? In 1981, the party declared that the Cultural Revolution had been a catastrophe. They admitted that. They also admitted that Mao had made mistakes, but they insisted that he had been bamboozled by counter-revolutionaries, a word that is one of the most flexible in the Chinese language. They then told the people to move on and look to the future. They began to progressively censor reportage, you know, anything too detailed, too explicit, that reflected too badly on the party, and literary or artistic work that also reflected too acutely or described too explicitly the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. The authorities also began quietly shutting down the archives and discouraging even academic work on this subject. The process of burying the true face of Cultural Revolution history accelerated under Xi Jinping, who has made a campaign against cultural nihilism, the telling of history in any way that differs from the official version, a hallmark of his rule. As a result, over the years, the Cultural Revolution has faded in memory to become a kind of a soft focus, nostalgic montage of kind of kitschy cultural artifacts like revolutionary model operas and Mao badges, alongside images of young people, their faces flush with idealism. Can I have my book for a sec? Like on the cover of Bombard the Headquarters, you know, they're raising their fists or their little red books to the sky. It looks really cool, you know, if you're a young person and you're looking at that, wow, you know? So without the details, there's a lot of sort of a nostalgia, right? Meanwhile, many younger people today live between the rock of job burnout and the hard place of high youth unemployment. They witness daily the gross inequalities of wealth and opportunity that mark the People's Republic today, including educational opportunities and access to health care, or simply their ability to raise their children in cities where they may have worked punishing jobs for years in factories or building sites. So it's not surprising that some young people today have come to nurture a vision of the Cultural Revolution as an egalitarian time when there was no corruption. Young people were honored as the revolution's successors and leaders and the flag bearers of a new age. There's a rising interest in China in Mao's writings and theories. Now, this kind of neo-Maoism presents a problem for Xi Jinping. His own family was very badly victimized in the Cultural Revolution. His half-sister committed suicide after their home was ransacked by Red Guards. He underwent years of re-education in the countryside doing manual labor. And so one legacy of this for him is a very strong preference for control over chaos. Mao destroyed, he says, let's just have a mass movement, you know, see what happens. Not Xi. Mao told the people that to rebel was justified. Xi tells them study hard, work hard, get married, raise a big family. Like Mao, however, Xi doesn't seem to believe that anyone but himself can really be trusted to guide the country. And so he has dangerously thrown away the safeguards against one person potentially ruling for life that were set in place in the 1980s by Mao's immediate successors. So he hasn't learned that lesson. He has tightened surveillance and control, including mutual surveillance and control within society itself, and especially in places like Tibet and Xinjiang. What is interesting, however, is that in current discourse in China, including on social media, when there are comparisons to be drawn with Mao, these often go to President Trump. One can lay claim to very few original thoughts in life. And I thought I had one back in November when Elon Musk, high not just on ketamine, but the whiff of power that was coming his way once his hired help took the highest office, called out on X for people to name the public servants who should be fired once Doge began operations. This predictably led some of the worst knuckle-draggers on X to heap rape and death threats and other kinds of abuse on people who were named and suspected of advancing such horrors as equity, diversity, inclusion, and climate change mitigation. And of course, it was around that time that in Australia, Jacinta Price popped on her MAGA hat to celebrate Christmas. And declared that she and Peter Dutton would make Australia great again. Now, all of this, reading that news at the time, especially about Elon Musk, I was working through the edits of my book on the Cultural Revolution, so I was thinking about all this. And the original thought I had, it turns out it wasn't original at all, was that despite the fact that Elon Musk would almost certainly know nothing of modern Chinese history, he had launched, in effect, an exercise in mass dictatorship. At his urging, the masses were calling out, policing, and punishing anyone they saw as committing ideological crimes. So, and I thought, well, in August 66, Mao said, bombard the headquarters. He was telling them, in essence, to attack China's version of the deep state and make revolution great again. So I began taking all these notes, and I was prepping for a talk I'd be giving at the Royal Asiatic Society in London in April, when my book was launched there. But as time went on, and I'm finding more and more parallels between the operations and rhetoric of Mao and his henchmen and Trump and his, I'm making this whole list. There's the attacks on so-called academic and cultural elites, which is, of course, a common sport of some conservative commentators here in Oz. The disregarding of scientific expertise, the utter disregard for due process, tick, tick, Mao, Trump. Add to that the intolerance of criticism, megalomaniacal self-confidence, personality cult, and mass rallies with the faithful, the threats of violence and indifference to the suffering of those deemed insufficiently loyal. History doesn't often repeat itself, but as Mark Twain once remarked, it sometimes rhymes. Now, in a conversation, when I talk about violence, in a conversation with a sympathetic American journalist, Edgar Snow, Mao, at the time, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao likened himself to a monk with an umbrella. Snow misunderstood Mao. He thought he was saying, oh, I'm just like a lone monk wandering in the rain. But Mao was actually quoting a Chinese pun. A monk with an umbrella is a man with no hair and no sky. Wu fa wu tian, which is a homonym for the expression neither law nor heaven, in other words, utterly lawless. Now, Trump has little wit and no talent for riddles. He did, however, once boast that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any votes. He has also suggested that a president could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, and on another occasion allegedly asked why the army couldn't fire on protesters, just shoot them in the legs or something. Mao was suspicious of those in his own inner circle, as I mentioned, and held long grudges against those he believed to have betrayed him. Trump, tick, similar. As it turned out, however, it wasn't an original thought. I wasn't the only one taking notes. Soon I began, even before I was able to do my talk, I began reading all of these articles by other sinologists, people who had studied China very seriously, including Orville Schell and Jeremy Barmay. They have written, many people have written incisively and from different angles about the parallels between Mao and Trump. But what is really interesting, as I mentioned before, is the number of Chinese commentators who've been speaking out as well. And as a Chinese journalist wrote in a later deleted post on X, coming from an authoritarian state, we know that dictatorship is not a system. It's not just a system. It is at its core the pursuit of power. We also know that the Cultural Revolution was about dismantling institutions to expand control. Now, this is not to suggest that Trump has taken cues from Mao, and no one would suggest that the ideology or the intellects of the two are in any way similar. For all of his for all of his tyranny, Mao, as I've written in The Big Issue in the UK, Mao was a more intelligent and interesting thinker than Trump, more original, well-read, and articulate. And he drew the sort of million-strong crowds that Trump could only dream about or lie about. He was a revolutionary, Trump's a reactionary. Mao wanted to destroy the old world to build and imagine new one. Trump wants to destroy the new one to restore an imaginary past. Mao helped miners organize a famous strike. Trump posed with a bunch of mining executives pretending to be miners. You can Google that one, it's a hilarious picture. Now, some commentators, even while noting the resonances between Mao and Trump, hasten to note the scale of human death and destruction in the Cultural Revolution. They say Trump, he may be trampling liberty, destroying educational institutions, destroying scientific, disrespecting scientific knowledge and all of that, but he's not killing people, certainly not at the scale we saw in the Cultural Revolution when nearly 2 million people lost their lives over the course of 10 years. Think again. As the Reverend Tim Costello wrote some weeks back, and I verified what he wrote and then learned even more by reading some of the original reports. The sudden cutting off of US aid programs to deliver vital HIV medications as well as vaccines and other life-saving medicines is expected to cost something like 2 million lives in sub-Saharan Africa alone, including the lives of some 500,000 children. And there are other places where the cutting off of US aid has already impacted people's access to clean drinking water and other things very necessary for survival. I have so much more to say, but I will just, I know that the time is up. I'm just going to read my last 2 paragraphs here. The great scholar of authoritarianism, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, has written that authoritarianism depends on breaking the horizontal bonds of solidarity and empathy that lead people to risk their safety, to protest injustices against others. There's nothing stronger than solidarity shown publicly, which is why the state responds with outside threats and violent acts. Rebecca Solnit, who quotes Ben-Ghiat in a recent edition of her newsletter, Meditations in an Emergency, notes that authoritarians want our worst selves, gullible, fearful, hateful, obedient, tolerant of cruelty, or actively cruel. Knowing what we do about history, including in Mao's China, our duty here in Australia, our duty to Australia, is to hold on to our best selves with all our might. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for a very interesting address. When I read the book, I didn't find any reference to Trump in it, but
no, there's nothing in there.
And I think Harrison Salisbury said that in the Cultural Revolution, he was a lefty, 100 million people were purged. Trump's only got up to 3.5, I think. It's a long way to go. But coming back to China and the Cultural Revolution, you'd be aware of in the 60s, in the mid-60s through the 70s, so many Australian academics and students went, not many in huge numbers, but a lot from various universities. They had the money, went to China during the Cultural Revolution, at the end, not long after the end of the Great Leap Forward, but through the Cultural Revolution, where teachers were being tortured, where they were being paraded around the streets, where people were starving, and where people were repressed. It was a bit worse than Trump in those days. And they came back and said how wonderful it was. So how did someone looking back on it now, I mean, how come was so many of our intelligentsia, young people as well as middle-aged people, how come were they so overcome with the with the Cultural Revolution that they came back and praised it?
That's a great question, and I think there were basically two types of Australian and other, Western visitors to China during that time. You had people who went in. The first part of the Cultural Revolution, they didn't have students there. It was after things had kind of calmed down. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of the second part of the Cultural Revolution. There were not these. The Red Guards had already all been sent out to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants and so on. So there was not the struggle sessions on the street and so on. There were two types. There was one type who went to study, and they began in like 71, 72, sort of around that time. And that would include Jeremy Barmay, who is one of the most outspoken people, if you read his China Heritage website, he features all kinds of dissident voices and champions the other China. And, I won't go into detail on that unless you want to ask more. But he was somebody who went to China, was educated in the Cultural Revolution for several years at universities, and he came back very clear-eyed. The other people, I think the majority of the people who came back with that kind of, everything is great there, perspective, a lot of those were on these, say, week-long or 2-week trips where they were taken in and they went to see, a school and all the happy school children receiving their, 23rd group for the month, recited their happy little poems and their songs and looked very happy. And then they went to a model factory and they did this and they thought, oh my gosh, everything is so good. So those people, I think there was more gullible people in that group. The people who, there's not that many people who went and studied, and of them, I don't know that many came back after a serious period of time in China. If they went enchanted, they came back pretty disenchanted. But it was interesting, just a little note, I went to North Korea for a day a number of years ago, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. I was going to be shown, a particular thing, but I just wanted to do it. I wanted to see it. And indeed, we were taken to see, these sort of model things and all of this. And it was so hard to imagine people being so willfully ignorant or willfully so determined to see something good that they could actually take a tour like that in China in the Cultural Revolution, and come back and say, "Oh, everything's so great." But if you want to read the epitome of that, find something like "Travels in China" by Rui Ali, a New Zealander. I hesitate to add, who has these things about. And then we took this plane, and he lived in China for years, and he was just an absolute spokesman for the Communist Party, and the Cultural Revolution was so great. We took this plane, and the attendants led us all in the chanting of quotations from Chairman Mao. It's like, oh, good on you.
Yes, he was a great mate of the Australian Wilfred Burchett. They went together on these trips. Anne?
I'll just add the same thing happened in the 30s when various Australians and Europeans went to Soviet Union. They were only shown what they were shown, and they came back with all their silly stories. But my question is quite different. One of the clever things about your book is that with all the words and all the books that have been written on the Cultural Revolution, you've written a snappy, short and to-the-point book, which in these days when we have busy lives and watch Foxtel, we don't read as much. But tell me how hard it was for you to condense, because how did you choose the theme, the thread, and how did you do it?
That's a great question. I mean, I had a little bit of practice when I wrote The Shortest History of China. But basically, I assembled all of the great books on the Cultural Revolution, books that have been, and I've credited them, you know, and they're in, and if you want the complete footnotes, you can look at my website. There's the total footnotes in a PDF there. But I've got limited footnotes in the book just because of space. But I stood on the shoulders of giants who had written very, very great books on the Cultural Revolution that are this long, you know, and looked at those things, but also thought, what do I want to, I always want to highlight the individual stories. I always want to show the big politics, the big threads, the big stuff that's happening, but also look at individuals, you know, what happened to people. And in this case, unlike, say, writing about the Ming Dynasty, I actually, because I began going to China in 79, 80, I actually met lots of people who had stories of the Cultural Revolution. Some of them have written about it since, and so most of the stories in there, if you read this, Yang Xianyi and his wife Gladys, the movie star who was a 10-year-old who made her way from Sichuan province to Beijing to be at one of the rallies, a Red Guard rally. All these people are people I know. And so I kind of chose those stories because I knew how to write those stories and I knew how to deal with their, you know, I often quoted their written memoirs, but I have a good sense of them. And so I thought I'm going to use that, and that'll be my own nice thing and my tribute to these people who survived so much. But I also always look at I like to do a balance of, as I said, what's going on in the big picture, what's going on the ground. I was also I realized I had not fully understood the scale of mass killings in the countryside. I had, like many other people, kind of reduced, in a sense, the Cultural Revolution to these Red Guards tearing up, you know, their campuses, you know, hitting their teachers, someone was killing their teachers, all that kind of stuff. I had certain images, but I had not really registered the full scale, the worst killings, the worst stuff that happened was all during these campaigns and ones of fake conspiracies in Mongolia and things like that. And so I wanted to make sure that those were addressed well enough so that people could understand how important they were as well.
I've got a question here from... Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering, you started talking about the Cultural Revolution with Mao. I guess I was just wondering how important you think Mao was to the Cultural Revolution, not in the sense that he was irrelevant to it, but in the West, in Paris, in the US, in London, you saw youth movements driven possibly by demographic movements at the time, the explosion of young people at that time. If Mao hadn't been the initiator, what sort of impact do you think that if any, do you think that youth revolution might have had in China anyway?
I don't think it would have happened not the same way at all. The party was generally very concerned about a few things like corruption, bureaucratism, and all this sort of thing. But Mao had that particular combination of personal grudges, charisma, power, you know, like he was the leader, you know what I mean? Deng Xiaoping couldn't have stood up and said, let's go, kids, you know, but Mao had that stature. And just to explain a little bit about that, as I write in the book, in 1964, there was this grand celebration of revolution. It was the 15th birthday, wasn't it? What was it? 25, thank you. And they were putting on this extravaganza with 3,000 actors, singers, dancers, musicians, and so on. Imagine that, at the Great Hall of the People. And it was the story of the revolution. And it was the story of, you know, how China had transformed from the society of, you know, oppressed people and da-da-da. And in the course of this, there's Marx and Lenin's pictures that are kind of floating above the stage. At a key moment, Mao joins them, but no other leader is mentioned in this entire thing. It was like Mao led the revolution, Mao leads the country, Mao is our savior. And people were really inculcated. He had a power over the youth that no one else did. There would have been movements, there would have been things that have happened, but not the same kind of thing. I'm quite convinced that it had to be Mao.
And I've got David from Canberra who asked, does the Trump-Mao connection stop where Trump wants small government and Mao wants state control of everything?
No, not really, because Mao did not want big government. He wanted a kind of a continuous churn. He didn't want bureaucrats sitting there for ages and spreading out their bureaucracies. So in that way, no, it actually continues with that.
Thanks. Hi, Linda. My understanding is that Xi's family and Xi himself suffered incredibly in the Cultural Revolution. So how come he's ended up, more or less, pursuing the same style of authoritarian dictatorship? I mean, is it personal power? Does he honestly believe this is the way for people to live their best lives? What is it?
It's not the same style of ruling the country, because Mao ruled by mass movements, right? He got the whole people. Xi wants to control everything. That is the part where he and Trump and, Trump, Xi and Mao. Okay. Xi is in control of everything because he doesn't totally trust anyone around him to be as smart or as capable, or to take the country in the correct direction. And so he definitely is where Mao liked chaos. Mao was happy with chaos. He liked mass movements. He liked to get the kids going and then see where they went. And then when it came time, when they were being a little bit of a pain and when things were getting out of control, okay, they've done what they were supposed to do. Let's send them off to the countryside. Xi has none of that. He is all about control and order and bureaucratization of process and everything. So he is not like Mao in that way. He is like Mao in believing that he is the person who needs to lead for a very long time, if not for life.
How did Deng Xiaoping survive after having such a disagreement with Mao?
Yeah, that is the question. So the two main enemies, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, from the beginning, because they had gone against the Great Leap Forward and mitigated all that stuff. So President Liu Shaoqi ended up being, he had the most horrific death in prison in the end. He was very, very badly abused, and he died a really sad, miserable death, which I describe in the book. Deng Xiaoping was sent away to a factory to work in I think it was a tractor factory, I can't remember. So he's kind of sent away. He sort of he's the great survivor, He manages to sort of get out of the direct range of fire for various reasons. He's then, after Lin Biao, the chosen successor of Mao, who then is accused of having a plot to assassinate Mao and dies fleeing to the Soviet Union when his plane crashes in Mongolia, that guy. When Lin Biao crashed and burned, there was this was 1971, the party really was shocked and shaken. And that was an opportunity for people who had believed that Deng Xiaoping and others who had been sidelined really needed to be brought back in. Zhou Enlai, we often think about the four modernizations and associate it with Deng, but Zhou Enlai talked about the four modernizations before that, and he believed that Deng Xiaoping was on the same wavelength. So Deng Xiaoping wanted to come back to Beijing, and he wrote to Mao, and Mao was like, anyway, between them, they sort of hedged on it, but then they brought him back to power. And they brought him back and they put him in charge of various things, including having to do with science and technology and modernization. but lots of people were on another side from him, and they were watching him, and they were like, what is he doing? Is that going to lead us down the road of respecting experts rather than people who are read? You know, all these complex quarrels. So Deng is there for a little bit. Zhou Enlai dies in 1975 in the beginning, and the very first mass protest in China in the Cultural Revolution, indeed in the whole period of the communist rule till then, takes place on Tiananmen Square. And in 1976, okay, so sorry, Zhou dies in early 1976, people start to throng onto the square, and the Gang of Four had forbidden demonstrations of mourning. You couldn't wear a black band for Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was widely believed to be the mitigator of Mao's horror. He was widely believed, it's controversial, I go into that in the book, it's not necessarily quite what it seems. Anyway, the thing that happens in Tiananmen Square after Zhou's death, now Zhou was kind of Deng's protector, this really shook the leadership, because this was a demonstration, it was a mass demonstration against the leadership. They didn't name Mao, but they kind of hinted at Mao. It was very much against the Gang of Four, it was against the radical stuff, it was against the Cultural Revolution. So what happens? Deng gets blamed, and he gets purged a second time. But he came back in time. In fact, to sanction, or was this when he was before that purge? Anyway, he comes back in time. He sanctions one of the last army massacres of civilians in the Cultural Revolution in a Muslim village, because they wanted to restore the mosques and go back to pray. And he had the entire village killed. Young people, disabled, everybody. And so he was not a goodie. He was, you know, it's all relative. He did some very good things. We can talk about that, you know. And when I say Mao was fiercely intelligent, I mean it. He was fiercely intelligent, you know, but he didn't necessarily use that intelligence for the good of, you know, always for the good of mankind, shall we say. But Deng came back a second time, and then had to kind of be in this power struggle, sidelined the guy who was the chosen successor to Mao, and kind of came triumphant. He never named himself any position at the top of the party. He was the chairman of the military commission. He was never the chairman of the party. He was very clever.
Now, we've only got about 10 minutes left, so we've got to be quick.
Okay, sorry, I'll stop doing with the long answers.
I think you've already answered this, actually, but I was living in Hong Kong at the time of both Chao's deaths and also Mao's. And, of course, as you well know, it was a city of refugees. And when Chao died, there was genuine sentiment. I had an office overlooking the Bank of China where the memorial book was. And when he died, people turned up in hundreds of thousands, genuinely.
Yeah.
When Mao died, they had to be bussed in by force, virtually. But you've already answered as to why that might be so.
Yeah, and the thing is that it was absolutely incredible. The mourning for Zhou really alarmed the Gang of Four. Mao was already very, very ill, kind of increasingly out of the picture. And the radicals were like, we don't like this at all. They always were struggling against Zhou in various ways. So the mourning in China itself was very genuine. And the reason they were so angry and poured into Tiananmen Square was that was being suppressed. The mourning for Mao, people in China lined the streets and wept. But as with many places where you have a dictator that suddenly dies, people weep for various reasons, you know, and they're scared what's going to come next. If you read a companion book to this is Sheila Fitzpatrick's excellent Death of Stalin. And she talks about the mourning of Stalin, and it has so many similarities, you know, just people weeping because what comes next? What happens to us?
Hi, I worked in China from 1998. I had to explain World Trade Organization to them, and first day I was asked to the People's Bank of China, ushered downstairs. I went on to work for about another 10 years. I was apparently, they asked me to stay on. what amazed me was during that period I observed a liberalisation, a relaxation, an admission of what we did was wrong. The urinals were converted back to Buddhist temples. People apologised to me for the way they'd treated their elders. And then things changed. And what they told me was that Xi Jinping was captured by the military-industrial elite, just as had happened in the 70s with Shapiro and all that writing. Is that true?
I wouldn't say that was necessarily true, but he certainly was the one who changed things. And I think it's his desire for control. And he's tied up with the military and, you know, other elite, but he also kind of owns them. So I'm not really sure that every society that's closed, every society where information is controlled is a hotbed of conspiracy theories. And so that might have been one, but what you observed was absolutely representative. There was an incredible growth of civil society, rights lawyers, and all this stuff was happening. And also a growth, two things happened. Even before Xi Jinping, there was the Jasmine Revolution, the color revolution, the Jasmine Revolution. That scared the Communist Party hugely. And they decided to clamp down on civil society for fear that it could become contagious.
I've got a final question here from someone in Hobart, and she asked, if she went into China now and publicly criticised, and she got a bit of publicity, if she publicly criticised or on social media Mao and or the Cultural Revolution, how would she stand? Would she be tolerated? Would she be silenced? In other words, you're saying, well, what's the position of Mao now in China?
Mao is revered. The Cultural Revolution is, you know, looked at with this like Vaseline lens sort of thing. No details, please. Mao is definitely revered. In the 90s, you might have remembered this, he became a god briefly, and he kind of still is in a way. But at that time, taxi drivers had him dangling from the rearview mirror as a you know, talisman against traffic accidents, and people prayed to him as if to a god of wealth of all things. But now he's revered, and he's revered among those young people especially who see that as a better time, as a more equal time, as a time when, you know, life was better for most people. That's how they see it. And so this is a real conundrum. Now, if you talked about the Cultural Revolution, people would be like, what? I was asked once by a young man, I was in a car, he was driving, it was kind of like pre-Uber, it was called a black car. It was like slightly illegal, but that's the only way I could get from this village into the, you know, back to the city. We had a long ride, and he said, so why do you speak good Chinese? And I said, oh, my Chinese isn't that good. Anyway, I said, I studied Chinese history and language, and he said, you studied history, I'm really interested in history. I said, oh, really? I said, what kind of history? He said, modern history. I said, like what? And he said, can you answer some questions? He said, like the Cultural Revolution. I said, what do you want to know? And he said, was it before or after liberation? Like that blew me away. And then he said, can you tell me about the Tiananmen incident? And I said, which one? I was thinking, it probably means 89, but I'm going to just test him on 76. And he said, the one in 2000, I said, you mean 89? And he said, 89. I said, oh, 76? He goes, 76? I said, what do you mean? And he said, 2000 and, I can't remember, 2 or something. I said, what was that? And he said, that was when the Falun Gong guy self-immolated on Tiananmen Square. And he had no idea about 89, he had no idea about 76.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
So what your man in China needs is a copy of Bombard the Headquarters in Mandarin or Cantonese. Or anyway, we've all had a good time tonight. There are copies available of Bombard the Headquarters. And to Linda Jaivin, well done. And
thank you so much.
Next time.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.